Okay, so this is an explaining history screencast for students who are trying to understand the causes of the end of the Cold War. And so, as you can see in front of you, we've got the images of Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev, and they are obviously two pivotal figures in this story, but by no means the only ones. There is a lot to be said, really, about events stemming back all the way to 1968. They help to explain why it is. In the mid 1980s, you have a situation whereby an unprecedented and unexpected series of diplomatic transformations take place that result by the end of the decade in an end to 5 decades of hostility. But before we go there, let's talk about 1968, and particularly the Prague Spring. The Prague Spring was really the last time that the practices of Stalinism were used and were capable of being used in Europe. The Czech pro-democracy movement that had, under Alexander Dubček, alarmed the Kremlin and threatened a breakup of the Warsaw Pact was, of course, in 1968 crushed by the Soviet Union, as they had done 12 years before in Budapest in 1956. Both those events in Budapest and in Prague had sent shockwaves through the communist world, particularly the world of the communist fellow travellers in Western Europe and America. And the idea that Soviet communism was a progressive and egalitarian creed was eroded in the first instance and completely undermined in the second. And this combined with the fact that after Khrushchev's secret speech in '56, many of the more repressive practices of Stalinism within the Soviet Union itself were really no longer applicable. It was very difficult to envisage a reinvention of the Soviet labour camps, in no small part because they had been horrendously inefficient and costly and had little real economic benefit. As was worked out, ironically, by one of Stalin's chief henchmen, Beria. The world that ended in 1953 with Stalin's death was not really possible to revive in the subsequent decades. So this kind of gives us a bit of the long term the long term context to the end of the Cold War. You have Stalin's death in '53, his denunciation in '56, which becomes a worldwide phenomena when the details of the secret speech become known. And then throughout the '50s and '60s, whilst the Cold War is at its height, there are fundamental changes happening within the Soviet Union. There is the development of a consumer economy which had been derailed by the experience of the war, which had existed in the 1920s and 30s. It had been derailed by the experience of the Second World War, and there was a real kind of renaissance in the 50s and 60s. And there was a shift away from in public attitudes towards demand for improvements in material conditions. Now, one of the chief underlying economic philosophies of the Soviet Union was that consumption and the allowing of individual tastes and preferences and consumer wants and desires and choices was an inherently corrosive and destructive thing. This is the route to individualism and materialism, and it is what would ultimately undermine the ardour that Soviet citizens should have for the revolution, the passion that they should have for building socialism. So instead, an economy shouldn't be about consumption, but it should be about production. And the Soviet economy, contrary to popular belief, the Soviet economy by the 1970s and 1980s didn't have shortages. It just had shortages of the kinds of things that people wanted. So there were overflowing warehouses full of goods that were being manufactured that people did not find particularly attractive and did not wish to buy. The central planning of the Soviet economy meant that a great many of these products that were available to the consumer but were unattractive were meant to be almost sort of nods towards consumerism, but consumerism within certain narrow parameters. So shoes and coats and jackets and clothes and other kind of soft kinds of consumer durables were standardized. So there were various different shades of brown, if you will. So there was a limitation of consumer choice, and the products themselves were it was hoped would satisfy consumer desire and give Soviet citizens a sense that the socialist society that had been created for them was working and was producing not an extreme range of choice which was seen as unnecessary and merely the kind of the illusory trappings of capitalism, but a kind of almost a sensible range of choices that meant that the Soviet economy was clearly providing for basic needs, and the kind of the more almost slightly spiritual aspect to socialism would provide for everything else, would nourish the soul. So the Soviet economy in the 1980s isn't able to produce the degree of consumer choice that is known about in the West, but it's not completely incapable of production at all. It is just that ideology stymies the kind of production that ideally Soviet citizens would like to see. The problem that Ronald Reagan presents to Mikhail Gorbachev is the vast cost of Star Wars, the Strategic Defense Initiative. The Pentagon was fairly certain Star Wars wouldn't work. Without going into a long science lecture, using lasers and other kind of pulse weapons in space to shoot down incoming missiles was virtually impossible. But it was the mere suggestion that it could happen that caused the Soviets endless sleepless nights. It was an end to the principle of mutually assured destruction. So it becomes an enormously destabilizing moment in the Cold War, and this comes after the crisis of Operation Able Archer, which was the moment that brought the Soviet Union closest to an all-out nuclear attack on the West. I'll cover the issue of Able Archer in the next video cast. So the costs of SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative, were astronomical even before it was considered to be possible. Margaret Thatcher, who was in fact the first Western politician to reach out to Gorbachev, not Reagan. Reagan was quite late in the game in getting to know Gorbachev. Margaret Thatcher had had made contact with him and actually visited Moscow in 1985 when she famously said, "Here is a man with whom we can do business." But Margaret Thatcher was horrified about the possibility of strategic defence initiative, because it meant that the next generation of Trident missiles that had been almost gifted by America to Britain to be stationed on British soil and comprised the British nuclear deterrent would become pretty redundant. The Americans, if they could make SDI work, would be less inclined to invest in the universally unpopular nuclear missile with its huge expense and its obviously terrifying consequences, and more inclined to focus on SDI. The British, who had not really paid for Trident and who were getting it for free, were trying to steer Reagan back in the direction of continuing with a conventional nuclear deterrent. Reagan himself was, and this is one of the things that's ignored about him, was immensely anti-nuclear, and actually at Reykjavik suggests to Gorbachev that they simply scrap all nuclear stockpiles. This is something that the Russians are stunned by, and Reagan's staff as well aren't expecting him to say it. So why did the Soviet Union and why did this vast militaristic empire simply cease to be in such a short space of time with so relatively little fallout? I say yet. Well, I suppose you have to look at the conditions of the late 1970s to find an answer to that one. If we look at the Soviet Empire across Europe, by the late 1970s, Poland is pursuing a very independent path towards socialism, as described by the Kremlin. Its invitation to the Pope in 1979 showed that Catholicism amongst the Polish people was still immensely more popular than any kind the Soviet communism that had been imposed upon it, and the subsequent development of the solidarity movement and the imposition of martial law by General Jaruzelski following that showed that there were significant challenges to the Soviet Union coming from within the Warsaw Pact, and not really, though obviously being given certain assistance, not really externally. One of the main problems that the Polish communist regime had was that it was mired in debt to Western banks. And why? Because they had tried to build a consumer economy and had felt that they needed to borrow in order to do this. The consumer economy that had developed was once again a sop to the Polish people, who were increasingly demanding higher living standards, and there was a knowledge that the old policies of Stalinism and the old repressive measures of Stalinism were no longer able to operate and function in quite the same way. That era had come to an end. So in a kind of post-repression era in both Poland and the Soviet Union, there are a number of alternatives. So one alternative is to try to build a standard of living for the citizenry which kind of rivals or perhaps even eclipses that in the West, which unfortunately that wasn't going to happen. And when that fails, there is little room for little place else for the regime to go, especially considering the fact that the Soviet Union, despite all its bloodshed and violence, is based on an inherently utopian, inherently benign premise that is trying to actually really solve the problems of existence in the 20th century. It's trying to create a society that is egalitarian and utopian, and all that has emerged throughout the 20th century is a society that is based on violence and brutality and repression, and one ultimately that doesn't seem to be able to actually answer those kinds of material questions. You've also got the problem of Afghanistan as well to consider. The military might of the Soviet Union is challenged profoundly in Afghanistan due to the fact that the Soviets are seemingly incapable of dominating the entire terrain of the country. The use of helicopters is made obsolete by the Mujahideen being gifted American Stinger missiles, and the original premise of the mission to reinstore the Soviet-friendly government in Afghanistan becomes a wider and wider mission, which eventually involves the occupation of the entire country, which saps the Soviet resources. And it's as Vietnam was for America, or going back a century, as the Boer War was for the British Empire. It is a humiliating defeat, and one which has profound implications for the rest of the Soviet Empire. And finally, the final factor, which throughout the 1980s, which suggested that the Soviet Empire was in terminal decline, was the crisis at Chernobyl. Again, I can't go into the scientific specifics, but the explosion at the nuclear reaction at Chernobyl in the Ukraine was a fundamental turning point in Soviet history, and really spelled the end of the regime in many ways, as it indicated that it was a regime that was incapable of managing one of the great kind of technological advances of the day, nuclear power. So there is a huge and varied context to the decline of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War. So let's say that you've got an essay on this subject, and you've decided that you're going to assess relatively the extent to which Reagan is responsible for the decline of the Soviet Union or the end of the Cold War. Well, yes, he does have a great deal of responsibility in this. In his kind of brinkmanship politics was very influential in ending the Cold War. However, the context that I've talked about in the last sort of 20 minutes or so really needs to be included as well, because without all these ongoing short-term and long-term crises for the Soviet Union, it's very unlikely Reagan would have had the kind of leverage that he had. And after all, Gorbachev was not looking to end communism. Far from it. Gorbachev initially was looking to reform communism so that it could survive in some other form, some more social democratic form. Ultimately, communism turned out to be an unreformable ideology, and hence its collapse. Anyway, I hope you found that useful. Now, if you need any more help or assistance, you can contact me at info@explaininghistory.com. You can visit our website, www.explaininghistory.com, and you can subscribe there to the Explaining History podcast. Anyway, look forward to hearing from you soon, and hope your essay turns out fine. Thanks very much for listening, and take it easy.